Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Procrastinator's Pit Stop. I am sitting here with a very exciting guest today. We are sitting with Robert Stupak. Robert is a real life treasure hunter who spent 5 perilous years excavating a hidden trove beneath his own backyard, surviving deadly traps while uncovering a mystery linked to Sir Francis Drake and ancient Miwok legends. Robert, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Chris. Glad to be here.
We're glad to have you here. Very exciting story. I'm ready to dive into it. But before we do like to have an icebreaker on this show. And the question for you today is, which cartoon character do you resonate with the most, and why?
I like Yosemite Sam because he's rough and gruff.
I like it. I like it. So Robert, you have to tell me. Not many people just start digging up their own backyards looking for things. How did you get started with?
I understand it was quite an unusual thing. Actually, I lived in the house where all of this took place for 13 years, and there was always a little trickle of water running down the side of my driveway. And one day, my neighbor who lived 3 houses away, he lived in his mother-in-law's house. I'm going to walk down, and we were talking about it. And I said, "Look at this! All of a sudden, the trickle of water has an oily sheen to it. Maybe when Sir Francis Drake was here," jokingly, I said, "maybe when Sir Francis Drake was here, somebody died. They threw him in one of the pits they were digging, and 400 years later, the oil is beginning to seep out of the lamp." And he looked up at me and he said, "The treasure of Sir Francis Drake is under my house because Grandma, who was his mother-in-law, had lived there since the house was built in the 50s. And on numerous occasions, somebody from Berkeley, UC Berkeley, came to her house and wanted to go underneath the house with the metal detector because Drake's well known artifact called the Plate of Brass was found directly below their house. So grandma never let him go under there, but that got me thinking because I didn't know much about Sir Francis Drake. I knew that he single handedly defeated the Spanish Armada, but I didn't know much about his visit to Nova Albion in 1579. And so that day, I started I went online and I read everything that I could about Sir Francis Drake and about the circumnavigation, which is when this particular landing occurred. And that evening, I was sitting there at my desk and I wanted to see what Miwok people look like because he encountered the natives called the Miwok. So back in those days, that was when JPEGs used to load line by line. We all remember that. And so I typed in Miwok, and all of a sudden a picture comes up and it loads. And it's a picture that was painted in 1816 by a fellow by the name of Ludwig Joris. It was on the Kotzebue expedition. They were recording nature, plants, fauna, uh, birds. And so the picture that came up was this picture. And it was the exact view I had been looking at for 13 years out of my bedroom window. And so I was like, I called in my girlfriend. I said, "Come on over. You're not going to believe this." And so she came in and she was shocked too. And one of the other things that I had learned from my initial reading, was that Sir Francis Drake was obsessed with the number 72. I had already noticed some rocks that were in my backyard. The grass would grow tall, but when I would cut them down and do the weed whipping, there were rocks that were in a pattern, I thought. And when I went out that evening with a measuring tape, the rocks were exactly 72 inches apart. And from there, I said, aha, I am on to something. And that started me on the entire journey.
Wow, that sounds pretty amazing that you actually were able to find that, and then you started digging for it. So, what did you find?
Well, when I started digging, what I did was I ordered a copy of the treasure map, which is actually called the Hondius Broadside Map of 1595. And it has a bunch of little, what they called insets along the sides of it. And one of the insets was a picture called Nova Albion, and that was the treasure map. And I used that to try to determine where the treasure might be. So I knew that Sir Francis Drake was a wizard in geometry, and this is how he used to defeat his enemies. He would calculate the angles that he needed to get to a place faster than the other people, and that's how he did it. So I drew my own map of my backyard and my next door neighbor's backyard as it looked out towards the bay, because that house had a great view of Larkspur Landing and San Francisco Bay. And that was how I was able to determine where to start digging. And then I just started digging. And the first thing, that first big hole, there were three places in my yard where nothing would grow. And I'd already lived there for a long time. I couldn't get any plants or grass or anything, no matter how much I watered it, nothing would grow there. So that was the first three places that I dug. And the first hole, as I dug into it, the ground was very, very hard in the summertime when it doesn't rain. So I had to, get my hose, let the hose water run on it overnight. I even had some friends come out and help me to dig it. So by the end of the first day digging it, we only had gotten down a couple of feet. It wasn't really anything significant. So I watered it again. But the next day when I came out, the ground was softened up and I dug down probably 6 or 7 feet. Well, as it turned out, that was one of the ancient smelters that they used. And so there were Boda bags that they used to carry the gold out of the mines in South America embedded in the wall. And so I took a sample of the inside of the smelter and I sent it off for testing to determine, for an assay to determine what was actually in that. But unfortunately, there was a lot of toxic material in there. And I didn't realize that at first, and I didn't wear a mask. I didn't suspect anything like that was going to happen. I got pretty sick from boron poisoning, because boron was an essential element in smelting in the 1500s, when, melting and smelting of metals was in its infancy. So that was how I got started. And then eventually I realized from the map, which is just a bunch of odd pictures with circles, black circles, white circles, and dots and periods, I decided I was going to excavate my yard in the shape of the treasure map. And sure enough, it looked like a war zone. It was a real mess. But eventually, I picked the one white mark where I had been excavating all the black marks, and the white mark led down under the ground and underneath a huge arch of stones. And I knew I had found something like that at that point. So from there, I just kept digging and digging, and that was all in the year 2000. What I've just told you about.
It's a very long, long project, huh? 20,
Well, it,
22
it
years.
was a very long project. And the problem with digging in Northern California is that there are rules, because it doesn't really rain between April and November. It's dry all summer. It virtually never rains. But come November, you get torrential downpours and it rains probably 3 feet in those 5 months where it rains. So that's why it took a long time, because each time I got close, I ran out of time, and the tunnels flooded, and I had to start over again, which was rather discouraging. But it didn't completely discourage me, because I kept going, but I could do nothing further until the following spring.
And actually, there was some allusions to a true crime part of the story. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. The artifact that I mentioned already, called the plate of brass, was one of the world's most famous artifacts, and it was discovered in 1936 on the street where my house was now. It was in front of my neighbors that I was talking to, and it was found by a person named Beryl Shin, and he didn't know what it was, and he held on to it for a while, and then he took it over to Dr. Herbert Bolton at UC Berkeley, who was a famous historian and worked in deciphering hieroglyphics and other things, because he could tell there was writing and there were markings on this little plaque, but he couldn't read them. So he takes it over to Bolton, and Bolton examines it. And within a couple of days, he makes a big public announcement that the missing plate of brass of Sir Francis Drake has just been found. And from there, it went on for about 2 years, where they did the most scientific testing available at that time. And then science was pretty advanced. And then in 1938, I believe, they made a public announcement saying that, yes, this indeed was the authentic plate of brass. Now, until the 70s, the plate of brass was displayed at World's Fairs, and it traveled all over the world. Everybody wanted to see it. And it's a small plaque. It's about 5 inches by 6 inches, a little plaque with very odd looking writing on it. But basically, the writing says, It has a date, June 17th, 1579, and it has a little statement that's signed Sir Francis Drake at the bottom in the metal, and it says, "I claim this land for Queen Elizabeth I of England." So in the 70s, for no apparent reason, there was a group known as the Drake Navigators Guild that claimed all of a sudden out of the blue that the plate of brass was a fake. And UC Berkeley, the Bancroft Library, who owned the plate of brass, went along and they decided to have it tested again. And when it was tested again, they picked another famous metallurgist, Dr. Cyril Stanley Smith, to do the work. And he did the work. It took him about a year. And when his report was issued, there was a big press conference. This is in, I believe, 1975, a huge press conference because the plate of brass was a very well known worldwide artifact. Because even though Sir Francis Drake isn't a huge name here, in South America and in India and in places that were controlled by England and Spain, every kid learns about Sir Francis Drake. So without Cyril Stanley Smith at the meeting, the Bancroft Library misquoted his opinion, and they led the public to believe that the plate of brass was a fake. Well, as it turns out, the reason that they were able to get away with that is because nobody had ever found the tools that were used to make the inscription on this plaque. And then in June 17th, 2002, which was the anniversary of the date on the plate, I found that set of tools. I found not only the set of rolling tools, but there was another tool I called the rod and the hammering plate. So I found all the tools. And when I found them, I was all excited because I could tell they looked like slugs. They didn't look like anything normal. And I had to wait till the next morning when the hobby shop opened so I could buy some clay. And when I rolled them out on the clay, they looked very much like the writing on the plate of brass. So I knew I'd found something. And that's unfortunately about 10 days later, I contacted UC Berkeley and I said, you have the plate of brass, you think it's a worthless fake? Well, I found the tools that are missing and it's probably a true artifact. Well, at the time, I didn't know that they were involved in putting a replica in place of the authentic plate of brass that they had. They had found a replica that came off some old ship that was a replica of the plate of brass, and they substituted it and they took the real plate of brass because they knew, and it was believed for 400 years that it contained a code, and if deciphered, they could determine where the treasure was buried. So they stole the real one, possibly cut it up to make a Mercator map. And when I came along, I don't think that they were too happy about that. So that's involved. That's part of the crime, and it goes a lot further into that. But I won't disclose everything at this point. But I will tell you that I have become a little bit of an expert on using these ancient silversmithing tools, and they match up perfectly. And the lines, took it to a mechanical engineering company. They measured the size of the lines. I've done everything to prove that they are the real tools.
And, so when you contacted them and they had no in did they have no interest in these tools?
Well, they had an interest because they told me to take one of them and have it assayed. Oh, I wanted the next day. I went over to this place in Concord, California, where there was a metallurgist who assayed things, and I left him one of the tools, and he drilled a hole in it to get the metal, and then he tested what the metal was. Well, unbeknownst to me, before I went to get the results the next day, he had already been called by somebody from the Bancroft Library, and they asked for the results. And from that moment on, they would never talk to me again. So I was very suspicious. And as it turned out, the assay showed that it was not any standard metal composition known. So it was something from 400 years ago when they kind of just mixed things together and made metal. So that made me very suspicious. I didn't let that bone go. I kept after him and kept everywhere, kept going every way I could to prove that these were the tools.
Well, you know what they say, keep hammering at it and eventually they may admit their wrongdoing, maybe another 50 years.
Well, as you know, it's such a long time in this situation that everybody except for one person who happened to have been the person that I was dealing with has passed away. So I think I'm going to win in this case because he's older than I am and I'm in good shape. I don't think I'm going anytime soon. So I'm going to get my chance to rewrite history. They wanted to rewrite history. They wanted to say the plate of brass was fake, that Sir Francis Drake landed out at Drake's Beach by the ocean. None of that was true. They were just trying to throw off any treasure hunters from looking in the right area. Because I found where Sir Francis Drake landed the boats, right near the San Quentin prison. There's a little beach there. It's a rocky beach. And I found a massive rock, probably gigantic, with a hole drilled in it. And down next to the rock, there were two iron spikes driven into the bay floor. Well, I dug one of them out, and these spikes were 4 feet long. And in the old days, they were called mooring spikes. And Sir Francis Drake passed the rope of the ship through the hole and around these mooring spikes so that his ship wouldn't float away. So that's how I know that he was there. And I've got one of the mooring spikes. I left the other one on the ground because I didn't want anybody to doubt where I found them.
Have you ever gone back to see if it's still there? Like maybe somebody else pulled one out too?
I go back there all the time because uh, this project that I'm working on currently has to do with Native American. Well, they're not Native American, they're really Paleo Indian wood carvings. And because of the way San Quentin sticks out into San Francisco Bay, a lot of things that float accumulate on one side of it. So I go back there fairly often looking for pieces of wood, and there are actually glass artifacts and some lava type artifacts. Because unbeknownst to virtually anybody in Marin County, there is a dormant volcano on the grounds of San Quentin Prison that nobody has been allowed in to see since the state of California took the prison for state land in 1855. So it's only on one map that this volcano exists in. It actually plays a significant part in the story because Sir Francis Drake did bury the treasure, and when he came back to get it, he had caused the volcano to erupt because he had covered up. If you're familiar with California, there are arroyos where water runs down when it rains heavily, and it does rain heavily. Well, Sir Francis Drake filled up many of these arroyos with a silver slurry. He converted the silver, the physical silver, into this gray clay and blocked these arroyos with it. Well, that caused the water, which normally ran down the hill, to back up into steam vents, which eventually generated enough steam and caused the volcano to explode prematurely. So that's why he did come back to get it, but he couldn't get at it because the ground was boiling or seething because it was so hot.
Oh, that's that's gotta be a bummer for him, right? To come back for it and realize you
I'm
buried
sure
it.
it was a big bummer for him.
Just swinging back a little bit, very much when you were starting to tell your story about the water dripping down the vent there, reminded me of the Goonies, and then going back to the traps and things, right? I've got this in my mind. Well, what kind of traps did you encounter?
Well, down once I got into the tunneling, I told you I dug under the arch. The first thing I found, I was digging underneath my two-tiered deck. There was a lower deck and then an upper deck with a hot tub in it. And when I dug underneath that, I found a cannon barrel. That was the first thing, and I was dug it out very gingerly, and sure enough, it had a touch hole, and I got it out, and then I went over to the stacks at UC Berkeley and did research into ancient cannons, and it matched exactly the dimensions of a cannon barrel from a Spanish galleon, and I held on to it for a long time, but I ended up moving up a lot of times. And let me tell you, this was huge. I think it was 14 feet long. So eventually that one went by the wayside. But not far inside of that, I started to find incredible clay pictures in the walls of the cave. And the first one was a picture of a parrot wearing a crown. And what these pictures were, because in the time of Sir Francis Drake, they really didn't have paper. Paper was a rare commodity. They had parchment, they had other things like that, but they didn't have paper that they could use. So what they did was they made a map of where you were supposed to dig via these pictures made of clay in the walls. And so after I pulled out the cannon barrel, that was the first thing that I found was a picture of where to dig. And I spent that very first summer, I spent the whole time digging in that area, and it went down underneath the deck. And unfortunately, eventually that did flood and it caved in. So the second time that I decided to try it, the next season, I wanted to I had already figured out how the treasure map overlaid the plat map of the property. And so I matched everything up. I figured out the scale and I had a space that I wanted to dig. And I hired a well driller to come in with his well drilling equipment on a holiday weekend because I knew the police wouldn't be around. And they drilled a hole 20 feet deep in which I put a gigantic sewer pipe, big plastic sleeve, so that I could climb down and it wouldn't collapse and trap me or kill me in there. So from there, after the 20 feet, then I dug out and dug down further. And the first thing I found was a gold covered rock. And just a few feet below that, I found a giant emerald, probably weighed a couple 100 pounds. But gemstones in those days were not the same as gemstones that we know today. Today we have the four C's: color, clarity, and so on. Back then, if you've ever seen the crown jewels of England, they look like beautifully colored rocks that have been glued onto the royal crown. They're not clear. They didn't know what faceting was then. So what was valuable then is not really valuable today. And back then, the clear stones were considered trash, and Sir Francis Drake would have left those behind. So what I found all the way through was incredibly beautiful colored stones that have historical value, but no real gemological value. Although I did find a diamond in the mix, you know, but for the most part, it was not the treasure that you'd expect.
And so the parrot with the crown, that was the right place to that was the rest to dig, so it meant that he was just labeling it, like, for anybody who would have seen that to come in, that would have found it then?
Well, I mean, you would have to understand that things in the 1500s were not drawn using perspective as we know today. Things were drawn flat. So that parrot in the crown is almost identical to the picture on the Hondius broadside map. It's the same shape, and I realized that right up front that this was part of the treasure. How to find the treasure. So I used that, and I dug out these rooms exactly the way it was shown on the thing, and there were other booby traps. There was one just like out of Raiders of the Lost Ark, where there was a series of seven stones on what looked like an altar, and I was very careful to take them off one at a time. And then when I took off the last one, there had been a huge boulder, probably the size of a Volkswagen, sitting up above me. And all of a sudden, I pulled this last one out, and everything started rumbling, and I thought the cave was going to collapse. And so I ran out. It did not collapse. It made a mess, and it took me a day or two to clear out all the debris. And it was mostly sand and silt. That's what fills in tunnels. It took me a day at least to get rid of the sand and silt. There was a collapsing room down there. Similar situation. I made this little room. It's like a kid underneath the ground with a fort. And I pulled out one rock, and all of a sudden sand started pouring in from this hole where the rock was blocking it. And within a few minutes, the entire room that I had been sitting in collapsed. Sir Francis Drake, whoever did the research on Raiders of the Lost Ark, did a great job because I encountered several of the same tricks, and they were all meant to be deadly. They were meant to either scare you away so you wouldn't come back if you were a treasure hunter, or to kill you. And that's why you always see pictures of dead men next to a treasure chest.
Well, that's sort of the ultimate irony, right? You get there and then you wind up being trapped in with it, right?
You very well could have. It would have been very easy to get trapped. They because he there was a creek that ran down from the top of the hill where today there's a water tank, but because the city captured that water and they use it. But when it was just a little spring, Drake made this thing to use it like the Roman aquifers, and he shunted the water in all directions that he wanted to. So that was the power that generated these trips. Because if you pulled out the wrong rock or moved something that was wrong, you'd hear this banging, like in an old house with radiators. When you turn on the heat, it goes clang, clang, clang. And sure enough, I realized after a couple of times when I heard that noise, something was going to happen. And I got out of there because every time something happened, I was 36 feet below the ground at the deepest point of the excavation. And this is in 2002. And there were two blue sculptures in the wall. One was just a round thing, and the other was a sculpture of a blue buzzard, for lack of a better word. It looked like a buzzard. And I said, "Oh, I'm not going to go in the direction of the buzzard. That looks bad." So I pulled out the blue rock. Well, as soon as I pulled it out, there was a little trickle of water coming out. And within 10 minutes, that little trickle of water got bigger and bigger. And I said, "Oh my God, there's a lot of water behind that wall, and I'm going to get killed if I stay here." And I went zipping backwards. I even ripped the cord out of the jackhammer that I was using at that time and went back to the surface. Now, the following day, I had day laborers. Most of them were Guatemalans that helped me because this generated a tremendous amount of dirt, and it was a long way down, and I couldn't bring it all up by myself. So I would go over like and pick up the day laborers. They would go down in the cavern and move all these buckets up via almost, passing them along to each other. So they come over on a Saturday morning, which was the day after I escaped the cavern, and they came back up within a few minutes and they said, "We can't work today." I said, "Why?" They said, "The whole thing is flooded." As it turned out, it was 25,000 gallons of water hidden behind a clay wall down there that was meant to kill you. So I avoided that one. I pumped it out eventually and continued, but pumps, they can only pump up 20 feet. So I'd have to pump it up to a trash can and then get another pump and the trash can to the surface. It was a very lengthy process. It's one of the reasons that it took so long. Plus, I basically did it by myself. A lot of people say, "Oh, you're crazy, blah, blah, blah." I did have one helper who was with me almost all the way through, a fellow by the name of Jaime, who came from Guatemala. And all the Guatemalans believed that I was right because they do hand dug wells in Guatemala that go down pretty deep. And they were all used to seeing these kind of pictures and images when they dug hand dug wells. So they didn't think I was crazy at all. And they liked working on it. I'd buy them lunch. We'd sit around the table and have lunch and drinks. And it was a good time, actually. I really enjoyed doing it.
I was gonna ask you that, like, how long, that would answer my question, how long were you able to con your friends into, helping you, dig
They
holes in
only
the
helped for
backyard there?
2 days. After the second day, they said, "Forget it. We got blisters. We didn't find any treasure yet," and they never came back. After that, I did it all by myself, which was better because the fewer people that knew, the better off it was. I mean, I did have some neighbors that were very interested because eventually I moved after everything collapsed in the backyard at the start of a winter. I moved to the front yard, and it kind of looked like that Superman episode where the creatures come out of the middle of the earth through this like porthole. And I made a little porthole with had a lockdown cover on it. And a couple of my neighbors even went down in there to see what it looked like. And Sir Francis Drake used everything that was out of historical context. And there are Irish burial mounds just north of England. And he reconstructed one of those Irish burial mounds as one of the other entrances to get down to the treasure. And when I dug it out, it looked just like it. It's one of the pictures in my book. Unfortunately, the front yard collapsed eventually too, because once again, you can only work from say April till November. And once it starts to rain, the clay, which is as hard as cement in the summertime, doesn't take much water at all and it becomes mushy and it collapses. So 3 times I had that happen to me where my work was destroyed almost overnight by rain. And I worked my butt off during the summer. I knew what could happen, and it just ran out of time. Couldn't go fast enough.
So, when you were down there, did you encounter any past attempts at treasure hunting?
No, nobody had ever been down there at all. I was the first person to find it. And the treasure, as it turns out, did run from one entrance was in my yard. The other entrance was at the top of the hill in a neighbor's yard. And that is where, and they both fit the treasure map. And that was the last place that I did any excavation was in that neighbor's yard in the time in between when the neighbors sold the house. And I would have loved to have bought the house next door, but it was $3.8 million dollars and I couldn't, I couldn't afford it. And people bought it like the second day it was listed. But before they moved in, I went up there and scouted around, which I had never had with, in depth before. And I found the other entrance to the whole thing and started working there until the people moved in. And then I asked their permission. They didn't want me to do it, but then I'm sure all the neighbors said, "Oh, he's crazy," blah blah blah. That was about it. But I did find Sir Francis Drake's name carved right into the stone in that other entrance, and I have a picture of that in my book. The book it's Nova Albion and the Treasure of Sir Francis Drake. It's in paperback form. You can also get it as a Kindle ebook and as an Audible book, and it's available on Amazon or through my website, which is novaalbion.com.
Yeah, no, it sounds like a very interesting read. I'm curious about some of the fallout now. Like once that you put out the book and once everybody knew that you weren't crazy and you were onto something, did anybody come back and kind of, you know, take it back some of the things they said? Or
No, oddly enough, people haven't really haven't taken it back. That house that I lived in at the time, I lost that house in 2012. I had been over leveraged when the real estate market crashed, and I lost that house to foreclosure. I moved about 7 miles away, so I wasn't in that neighborhood very often anymore. As a matter of fact, I avoided it because it had a lot of bad memories. So yeah, nobody came back and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I said all of this stuff." No, maybe people will now. The book was really released recently, so not a lot of people have read it, and not a lot of people know the story. Maybe I'll get some more apologies, but I don't really care at this point because I know I was right. Finding his name carved in the rock below the ground, that was good enough for me.
yeah, that actually brings me to another question. You know, you've got this new project. Is that's going to be another book, I imagine,
Well,
when
I
you're
don't think
done.
it's going to be a book. I'm making a website. As you see behind me, there are these carved sticks. Some of them are artifacts and very, very old. There's no telling how old they are. It's very expensive to have carbon dating done. It costs thousands of dollars for each item you want to carbon date. And there is a group on Instagram called Stick Nation Reviews. And I didn't know anything about it. Somebody told me about it and they said, you ought to take a look at this website on Instagram. And I did. And it turns out they have 3 million followers. So I wrote to the fellows who ran that site. I said, look, my daughter doesn't want these sticks. My family doesn't want these sticks. I'd like to cash out of them because they're incredible. Are you interested in doing a website where you could have a stick exchange or make it like eBay where people could post their sticks and sell them, or they could buy sticks if they like? And they didn't want to do it. So I went ahead, and that's website should be up and running within a couple of weeks now. There's a lot of people who like sticks before it's even up on Facebook. I think I've had 626 people look at the page and it just says coming soon. So that's my next project.
Do you think that you'll ever go back to treasure hunting again as well? Or
I would. I mean, there are things that I know about treasure hunting that nobody else does. The treasure map was public knowledge for 400 years and nobody ever figured it out. And even if they had, they never would have figured out some of the intricacies that I figured out. So if somebody had, like, I think I know where the treasure is on Oak Island that they keep digging for and they miss and they never find. And I'm sure there are some other buried treasures where they've never been found, and there may be hints that I could gain some information from. So I would do it if somebody wants to hire me. I'll be more than happy to continue my treasure hunting.
you know, I'm curious, not revealing any secrets, but how did you go about it? Was it like a puzzle? Was it like something that you did sort of little by little to figure it out?
Well, yes, it was. It, the initial work involved the pictures on the map and digging out the excavating in the shape of those treasures, of the marks on the map. And then I found also that at the start of each section, he Drake put a what I call a map rock. They made maps on rocks in the old days because, once again, paper was a rare commodity and a rock wouldn't be destroyed. So when I would start a new section, I would look for the map rock and it would tell me exactly where to dig. So yeah, there are little things that I know about buried treasures that other people might not.
Such
Because there's never
a
been a huge buried treasure found on land. And I found where it is. It's just that the neighbors won't allow me to dig it because they're wealthy and they don't need the money, even if it was a huge amount of money. And so maybe someday they will allow me to finish the job because, I did spend a good portion of my life working on this project. And I'd like to bring it to completion so that everybody could see what it really is in the end. My guess is I've looked at the map rocks. I've looked at everything that they have, that I pulled up. And my guess is there was a small portion of it that Sir Francis Drake kept stuff for himself. And that was what I found at the opposite end of the trail there. And I believe there is some gold and some silver and some precious stones. But, the treasure was reportedly 26 tons of silver and 80 pounds of gold and many chests of gems and jewels. Well, the chests of gems and jewels I found, as I said, they really didn't have much value. Silver, a lot of it was converted back into that clay slurry that he filled up the arroyos. That was how he hid it. But I'm sure he kept some silver pieces for himself. But I do believe that he took really almost all of the gold back to England because he was a hero when he got back there. And it was because he had enough gold that it paid off the debts of the entire country of England from waging their war against Spain. They were in that war for a long time.
it's such a fascinating story. I could probably go on for like another 2 hours on this and pick your brain and figure things out and maybe whittle a secret or two out of you. But we are coming pretty up close to the time. Is there anything that you wish I would have asked but didn't ask, or
But
anything that
not really.
you?
I think we covered most of it. I would tell everybody that if you really want to get the full story, you should buy the book or get the Audible or the ebook. Now the paperback and the ebook contain 100 pictures and there are links as you're reading the story and they link right to the pictures. So if I'm talking about the cannon barrel, it's got a link under it. You click on it and the Kindle book and goes right to the picture of the cannon barrel. And then you can go right back to where you were reading. So it was written very differently than most books, and I think readers will really enjoy it. And it could be for kids. There's nothing profane in the book, as well as adults of any age.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Robert. Just
My
one
pleasure.
one more thing. One more thing before we go. If there is an avid, treasure hunter amongst us, and they get the book and they want to contact you, what is the best way to reach you?
You could reach me through the Nova Albion website, nova-albion.com, and there's a contact form there. And if they want to get a hold of me, that's the best way to do it.
Excellent. And to all our listeners, don't worry, we are going to have those links easy for you in the show notes so that you'll be able to look at that without an issue. Robert, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your time, and
Thank you, Chris. I enjoyed it.
we can't wait to see what you do next. And to all our listeners, thank you once again for tuning in. And just remember, if you can't find that motivation or inspiration for yourself today, Robert here dug a hole, had it filled in, pumped it out, dug again, and he actually got where he wanted to go. So, if you can't find that
I
motivation,
say persistence is omnipotent.
I love that. I love that. So, maybe just go out and help a fellow treasure hunter dig a hole. They may not be crazy. And we'll
Right.
see you again next time.
All right. Well, thank you very much.